advocacy side and now the government side. I also did an MBA at Booth, ending in 2019. So I, talked a little bit about the industry side of things, and I work a lot with industry now. So happy to answer any questions on that front too. So I think the trifold goal here is to talk about how I got to where I am, to talk about opportunities that are out there and kind of the day-to-day experience of what I do and things that have helped me along the way. So maybe I'll just start with the kind of timeline. So I was a comparative literature major in undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania. I studied comparative literature and Hispanic studies, which is basically Spanish. And I did a master's thesis in Russian literature, looking at Tolstoy. And so then the geography of sight in Tolstoy. And I thought I would go on to do a PhD in Latin American studies, and focusing on Latin American literature. I really liked Latin American literature of the 1970s. During a lot of dictatorships, they really got creative with how they would write about things as a form of social protest. And so I was really interested in that. So I went to South America after I graduated from college, and I went to Chile. And I got a teaching certificate actually first in Buenos Aires, and then I went over to Chile to teach, because that's a good way to get to a different country. And so I got a job doing that in northern Patagonia in Chile. And while I was teaching, the Kindle first came out. So it was the very first Kindle, and my parents sent me one. And I was like, oh my God, I have all of these books suddenly in English at my disposal. So I started reading a lot. And I started reading nonfiction, where I never had really read a lot of nonfiction before. And I was like, here are all these people doing really interesting, concrete things. Is he having me move? Sorry, I was joking about making you move. No, you're good. Do you want me to? No. I'll just move down so it's more central then. So yeah, I started reading a lot. I was like, here are people doing a lot of really cool applied things. Let me think a little bit about whether I really want to do academia or if I want to do something more applied. And I had already at that point applied to and gotten into master's programs in Latin American studies, because that was the first step to a PhD, right? And I ended up choosing Stanford because the master's program was only 1 year. That was a very big factor. And I went there, but they had 3 different concentrations. They had culture and society, political economy, and environment and ecology. And I originally was going to do society and culture. And I was like, no, I think I'll change my mind and I'll drift in this other direction. And I ended up doing concentrations in the other 2. And we had an ecologist that was the head of the program at Stanford. And so I ended up taking a lot of really good courses on environment and ecology track. And this was all in the context of Latin America. And I was getting so much good information and really learning a lot about the political economy of these countries, the environment, the ecological concerns of the countries. But I didn't have a lot of tools because I'd been a comparative literature major. I had this master's in Latin American studies. And so at that time, they were launching their master's in public policy at Stanford. And you had to, I think this may still be the case, but you had to apply from within the school because it was new, this new program. And they were trying to distinguish themselves by being really quantitatively rigorous. And so I was like, here's a program that can teach me all the stuff I need to know. And so I went to that program and stayed 2 more years at Stanford, did an MPP with a focus on energy and environment. And I chose that track over the international policy studies track because I did what's called a subjective linear model, which is where you rank, here are all the things that are important to me about the career path that I go on. And here's the kind of ranking that I give all these different things in the different spaces. And environment ecology came out on, or environment and energy came out on top, primarily because of the fact that I thought I assessed it as an area that was only going to grow. Like we were kind of at the beginning of the clean energy revolution, and it was just going to continue and grow. Whereas education policy and international policy studies were much more like a little bit entrenched, and they had a very long history. And if you want to do education policy, you should probably be a teacher. So all these other reasons moved me towards energy and environmental policy. And then I got a fellowship at NRDC coming out of Stanford. That at the time was called the MAP Fellowship. I think it's called the Schneider Fellowship now. I had that fellowship for a year, and then they kept me as a contract employee for 1 year and then as a full-time employee for 4 more years. And I moved to Chicago through NRDC. I worked on 3 different projects during my time at NRDC. So I started as a now Schneider Fellow for 1 year in the federal policy program. This was around the time of what's called the Clean Power Plan. So putting trying to get emissions reductions at power plants. And I was helping to draft our technical comments on those. And then I moved to Chicago to keep working on Clean Power Plan implementation plans with states in the state policies side of things. And then when the Clean Power Plan was stayed by the Supreme Court and then forever frozen and turned into something completely unrecognizable by the Trump administration, I moved on to a different project called the City Energy Project and worked on energy efficiency in buildings as the City Energy Project in a few different capacities. I rolled off of NRDC at the end of that project. I declined to move on to what was the next stage of which is called the American Cities Climate Challenge. And because I had also finished my MBA at that point and I wanted something new. And then I took a job at City Colleges of Chicago as their director of civic engagement. And I continued to work as a as a consultant for NRDC at the same time. And so when I was at City Colleges, I was working on the census. I was working on COVID response because my first days were in March of 2020. So we had to come up with a lot of response there. And they really partnered with the city on a lot of things. And then the general election was another big thing. And then in the course, though, of doing some research for NRDC in my free time, I discovered this role at the ICC, the Illinois Commerce Commission. And I was like, that sounds interesting. I think I'm qualified for it. I don't really know what it's about because a big hint on the government job stuff is the descriptions are really, really bad. And so you just need to talk to people on the teams about what the jobs actually are. But I applied and I got an interview, was offered the job, talked to a few people about what it was like to work there, and then took the job. And I've been there almost 3 years now. And love it. Absolutely love working on the implementation side of things. So that was my very quick overview of a lot of pivoting.
I had a question. So you got your MPP, and then after that, if I'm correct, you went to your MBA, right? So I was just curious, like, why you did your MBA, and like after your MBA, you still like sort of stuck with the policy side or like the public sector. So I was curious about that.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. I'm not against working for the private sector. I just really love working for nonprofits and government. And I think it's because nonprofits are pushing the edge and government is making sure nobody gets left behind. So private industry might be out there innovating in response to nonprofit advocacy. So they're out there and competitive pressures and things. So they're out there innovating, but to make sure it actually reaches the scale that we need it to reach, that's where government, I think, is really critical. And so I found this very niche area that I think is actually like really complex, but really transformative. And it's a really great space to be in. But I went to business school because I wanted to understand how businesses make decisions. Because if I wanted to continue in advocacy, I wanted to be able to advocate in the right way and for the right things and actually get the behaviors I wanted to see. Because sometimes when we advocate, we get like the wrong response. So I wanted to understand, okay, what do they really care about? And then how can we kind of create incentives to get the behavior we want to see? Yeah.
So, and this may be something you touch on later, but you mentioned that one of the things that drove you to energy and the environment in general was the growth you see in the field. And obviously for the last of 10 years, there's been incredible growth. What do you see kind of for the next 10 years in terms of growth?
I think it's going to be incredibly challenging. And I think from the conversations that I'm in all the time in the energy space is it is a graying workforce that like it's run by a bunch of like old, mostly male engineers, and they're all going to retire all at the same time. And there's nobody coming in to replace them. And so there's a really big, people are really concerned about the chain of people coming in to work in the space. So I think in terms of job growth, I think it's huge. The other thing that we're confronting, and I think we're going to see this in like 2028, so near term, not even 10 years from now. But I think we're going to see the transition hit a point at which we're going to need to be really, really careful and strategic about how we don't have rolling blackouts, because we're making this transition really quickly, which we need to do. But the change is drastic. And so you've got these huge base load power plants all coming offline at the same time. And Illinois is a really good example because we passed legislation in 2021 that's requiring the retirement of all these CJEB. So all coal plants will be gone by 2030. All gas plants will be gone by 2045, 2035 if they're in an environmental justice community. So this is really, really big change, and all of that has to be backfilled by something. But there are processes that are really opaque and people don't understand in order to get the replacement generation on. And this is what they talk about when they talk about the interconnection queue delays. And so all of those processes are really complex and really slow to change. And like, so we're gonna have to manage that transition really carefully. And I think that's where a ton will have to happen.
I had a sort of follow-up question on that because I've read a little bit about interconnection queues and speculative projects that delay, that create the backlog.
Yeah.
And recently I was reading about this work order 2023. So I was just wondering how effective do you think that is in like solving the backlog, and like what more is needed from the industry to like really resolve that issue to get more news on that?
I think a lot of what happens with FERC orders is it just raises the floor, because they just make sure that everyone is kind of they take what some regions are already doing and just make sure that everybody at least does that. I don't think it fixes everything. And so part of the problem when he's talking about is when you're going to come online at the wholesale market level, then you have to go through a bunch of studies to make sure you're not going to like totally disrupt the system. And those studies in PJM can take 6 to 8 years. In MISO, theoretically, they could only take a year. So PJM is the Mid-Atlantic region, MISO is the Mid-Continent region. Theoretically, it could take a year or two, but they've been taking longer too. And it's partly because you've got one company in there putting in like 4 projects because they want to hold their place in line. But every time, but it's really only one project. They've got it in there 4 times. But every time somebody pulls out, they have to start all the studies over again because the entire system is interconnected. So if you plug in, you're going to affect everything. So FERC recently came out with an order, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who has jurisdiction and regulates these wholesale energy markets. They came out with a decision, an order called Order 2023, because it's 2023, to try to streamline that interconnection process and say, well, batch these things and process them quicker because you'll do them in clusters, and you'll have penalties, and you have to like have some skin in the game. You have to put down deposits if you're going to wait in line. And then you've got markets that are doing their own thing too. So like MISO right now will be filing imminently or just filed their interconnection queue reforms, which would basically cap the amount that gets through every year and require even more skin in the game because they're still trying to move things through faster. But the problem that we're seeing on the ground is not the queue anymore. It's the project's actually getting built. So there's something like 40,000 gigawatts of energy that has gotten through the queue and is like, they have signed interconnection service agreements. So you are okay to go. You can start anytime, and they're not building. And you hear a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it is inflation. You had projects enter the queue 6 years ago and COVID happened and you had legislation happen. So a couple of those are gas plants in Illinois does it make sense to build a gas plant in Illinois if they all have to be closed by 2045? So it's hard to say like how much of that is the queue problem and how much is are kind of all these other factors. One interesting conversation that we've been talking about more informally and then might be trying to push as solutions is a more holistic approach. So can you fast track the kinds of generation or the locations of generation that you need to replace the retiring generation, and then couple that with transmission planning so that if you have a sudden and immediate need, like a coal plant retiring, you can actually like try to patch it all together instead of waiting for whatever gets through the queue whenever it gets through the queue. So yeah, job security.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, so and if it's okay, I have another question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, I mean, you kind of pointed out the difference between like, I mean, there's RTO policy, I guess, there's state policy, there's federal policy. You've exclusively worked in state and federal policy, or have you worked in
And city.
and city? Okay.
So I've worked at the city, state, federal, and wholesale levels. So I've worked pretty much at every level of energy
Okay.
policy. Yeah.
And what do you think, I mean, in terms, I guess, just differences in general, what do you think is the most impactful? And they'd be impactful in different ways.
In different ways. I think they're all impactful in different ways. I think the federal policy is like steering a very large ship and it's very slow. But if you get something like the Inflation Reduction Act, that is a lot of money and a lot of investment that needs to happen. Or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, I think it's called. That one, the IIJA, also really important for the scale of the change we're going to see. Like investments, like I got a heat pump for my house and I got it on January 6th, 2023, instead of December 29th, 2022, because I can get a tax credit this April for getting that heat pump earlier this year. And I'm just one consumer, but if everybody's making decisions on what to replace based on the federal policy, like that's a big deal. They also set standards, like efficiency standards for appliances and windows, like all of those matter. State policy, I love the other three categories. The federal policy is its own thing, but I think the other three are really fun and impactful to work in, and you get to work with a huge range of stakeholders and you get to see tangible results of what you're doing. So city policy, cities are going to city regardless of what federal or state government is in charge. Like cities are going to do what they do, and they do potholes. And they do buildings, and they do building codes and building safety, and they do, oh God, our streets are flooding all the time. Maybe we need to build some stuff. And that's a really cool space to work in because it's very on the ground and it's very much working with different communities too and making sure they're all represented. So when we did our building energy efficiency work, we were talking to a pretty diverse group of stakeholders, and a huge stakeholder in that is the real estate industry. And that's a slow, conservative industry to move along. But it's like, it's challenging and it's really interesting. State policy is the very, very wonky world of public service commissions. That is where a lot of the energy policy is going to happen. Not all of it. There's always legislatures and the governor's office and things like the Illinois Power Agency, which is really hard to describe, but public service commissions are where a lot of the action is. And if you have tolerance for really boring regulatory processes, that is a great, impactful place to be, because that's going to just determine the levels of energy efficiency that we see. That's going to determine how much we spend on all of the investment that we need to see by the utilities. This is where this private and public space comes together. So we're directing private investment into things that serve the public. So that's kind of where state policy is. And then RTOs, nobody knows what they are. Like PJM and MISO, nobody's heard of them except for like the rare few. I barely worked on this until now. This is like my everyday job. And now I feel like I've learned a whole new language. But it is hugely impactful. Like we are making changes in transmission planning in PJM, which spans from Chicago to New Jersey down to North Carolina. And they do the transmission planning for the region. And if what we need to see are these long high voltage lines connecting the region and getting a huge array of diverse resources online to replace the outgoing less diverse resources, then that's where it's going to be planned. And so we've been advocating really hard for holistic planning, for that long-term, long-range planning, and for consideration of high voltage projects. And they're actively working on it now. So that unlocks a lot of opportunity for new resources to come online. A couple of things. One, a lot of companies do have ESG goals. That's like environmental social governance, I think. And those do show up in all the planning that the RTOs and public service commissions do, because they do have to show how they're meeting those goals. Sometimes they're just greenwashing and sometimes they're really committed to it. It kind of depends on the company. So private industry is really important in that way. I also think there's going to be a huge role when it comes to distributed resources. So this is not only on the consumer side and consumers participating in their energy use, but also in the deployment of new technologies. Because I used to have a boss who talked about how, like, since the age of Prometheus, we've been burning things for energy. And that's true. Like, we've been burning coal and gas. But there are all these new resources coming online. I think that's and that's going to be private industry for the most part. Government will be enabling it. Like in Illinois, we just lifted the moratorium on new nuclear so that they can build small modular reactors in Illinois. But that'll be paid for by private industry, mostly.
From like previous work I've done at the town/city level, I've seen like there's like a lot of times there's like resistance from the town to work with private industry and to get that funding to pay for projects. Do you feel that's the same thing too? And like, how do you work around that?
Funding is tricky because there's a lot of history of, I would say, abuse of that funding. And so there's a lot of process and transparency involved in making sure that that is procured and then spent in the proper ways. So I think probably the process itself is a huge deterrent. But there are public-private partnerships and examples of those. And I think they're encouraged even right now through a lot of the funding opportunities at the federal level. So we're working on one right now where you can be any kind of entity, but you have to have a state partner to do some research on wholesale electricity markets. And so that's directly encouraging. The money would then go to the states and not to the partners, but then the states would disperse. But I really do think working in the government at any of those levels gives you a much better understanding of those complications, so that if you ever are making the policy or advocating for the policy, you can keep it in mind. Like, it's as easy as people think it is. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. Well, I think there was a report that came out of UChicago recently suggesting it's not the greatest. I think the industry, I think the jobs will be there. Whether it has the kind of impact that people want it to have, I think it kind of depends. And I think it also kind of depends on each company's individual governance. Yeah. But I think the industry will remain. I think companies are going to continue to care about that. I think it'll grow. I just see these challenges as continuing to grow. And I was saying, in the next decade, the energy transition is really going to hit a point. But also so is the climate. We've got some very, I think Winter Storm Elliott, most recently Winter Storm Uri. Before that, we had that heat wave in August. Like, I think people are experiencing this stuff, and it's come into the. We used to not be able to talk about it in the energy spaces. You just would not talk about climate, and you still mostly don't. But we heard the CEO of PJM at our it's called OPSI, so Organization of PJM States. So we're like an advisory board for PJM made up of the state agencies, the state public service commissions, and we have an annual meeting, and he came and he spoke at it, and he was like, we know that a few things are true. The energy transition is here. We know that climate change is here, and we have to do something about it. And we know that it's gonna cost a lot. And so he was talking about how we have to manage the transition, and sometimes we see that as the RTO is kind of slowing things down. But I think the urgency is enough that people, if people like Manu Asana are talking about it publicly at these meetings, I think the industry is not going anywhere. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Second year student at Paris.
Oh, great.
I just met my mentor. She works in DNB consulting, and she said that $8 billion is being given to the states. What do you think is the area they're going to invest in?
States.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money it depends on the program, but there's a lot of money going to resilience instead of mitigation now. Not instead of, but in addition to. So I was just reading an article the other day about the GRIP funding and how about 50% of that has gone to Florida, California, North Carolina, and Washington State. And part of that, I thought this was a really interesting article that kind of gets at what you were saying, is the reason those 4 states dominate. They actually only make up 30% of the population, but they're getting 50% of the funding of the eligible population for this funding. It's because they have these teams in their states that are applying for the federal grants. And so when one gets announced and they're like, okay, we'll get our application together and get it in. So just in terms of that internal process that you have to stand up and that infrastructure you have to build. But I think a lot of it for states will also go to supporting projects that we want to see done. So the Minnesota Department of Commerce just got almost $500 million to support some projects between MISO and SPP, the 2 wholesale markets. The SPP is Kansas and West. And there are these seams projects, making sure that you can interconnect along these seams. And those were projected to cost upwards of $1 billion. And the Minnesota Department of Commerce worked with MISO to put in an application and secured $472 million, I think, just to basically offset the cost of that project. And so I think states are looking for opportunities like that because the costs of the transition are not going to be small. The scale of the transmission, that build out that we need to see is enormous, and it's really expensive. And so states are going to be doing everything they can to make sure what we do on the wholesale side doesn't translate into huge bills for customers. So I can also see programs maybe like LIHEAP being supported and maybe expanded. So LIHEAP is the, I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but Low Income Heating Something Assistance Program, Energy Assistance Program. And so it helps people with their energy bills during cold months.
Would you say that it affects how you view regulation at all, or not really?
That's a good question. I don't know that it affects how I view regulation, but I think it affects how I view business interacting with regulation. Because it's not like anybody, well, no, I take that back. There are plenty of people out, like maybe not doing great things, but a lot of people who work in the private industry side of things are just trying to like maximize different goals, right? Or optimize for different aims. But you could actually all achieve kind of the same thing as long as all the incentives are in place. I'm not making policy in my current job. I'm implementing. But I think it helps me translate. I think it helps me talk to private industry in a way that they're very responsive. Like we're all on the same team. All of us want to keep the lights on. We have this policy in Illinois. You guys have these goals, the ESG goals, but also, profit margins that you need to protect. And so let's like see how we can make these things compatible. So, yeah.
Yes, just a couple things. So you're talking about regulation. Like, what do you mean by that exactly? Is that like regulating like carbon emissions, or is that like a different kind of regulation?
Frequency rate. No, I'm talking about what we do at the Illinois Commerce Commission is we regulate the utilities, and including the spending of the utilities and the investments that they choose to make. And that's because they've been granted a monopoly. So there's a public interest to some of these companies having a territorial kind of monopoly, because you don't want to overbuild the system and have everybody paying for it. So natural monopolies, but they need to be regulated because otherwise they could just do what monopolies do and increase the prices for everyone. So that's what we do.
The only goal is profit margins.
Yeah, and that's not our only goal of energy provision, especially now that everything is dependent on that. So
I also want to ask you briefly on ESG.
Yeah.
Like, is the ideal, like, if there's like an ideal like ESG like rating, is that different for different companies? So for example, like if you're like a gasoline company and you inherently have a certain impact on the environment, would your ESG goals be different, or would the number goals be different from say a company that doesn't deal with fossil fuels?
I don't know the answer to that. Sorry. I can tell you outside of ESG, yes, your goals will be different. And you might emphasize like what you bring to the local community and giving back to the local community over the kind of net emissions that result from your work. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think someone touched on this already, but I know like a lot of companies now are moving away from the term ESG. And do you still think that there's still drive at the company to create positive environmental change and they're just losing the term, or is the entire movement being lost as well?
No, I don't think the entire movement's being lost. I think it's basically having to undergo a fundamental rebranding. Just like, I don't know if maybe you guys weren't old enough. Solyndra, the DOE loan programs. No. Okay. Under the Obama administration. Okay. So there's a pretty cool guy named Jigar Shah who currently runs the DOE loan programs. But back in the day, in the Obama administration, I was in grad school at the time, kind of dipping my toes in the water of energy policy. They were giving out loans to kind of interesting new tech because they needed the loans to commercialize, to go from like, hey, we've innovated, let's get commercialized now. So just kind of get them over that, what's called the valley of death or the valley of commercialization. And they made a really, really big bet on this company called Solyndra, and it failed. And there was a huge scandal in the news. And everybody pointed fingers at the DOE loan office and was like, look, Solyndra failed. Like, clearly this just doesn't work. But there are plenty of stories from that period of things that did work, right? And the reason I bring this up is like, Jigar Shah is now the head of the DOE loans program, and they are making all these loans to all these new tech. And it's like because they had to wait some time and kind of rebrand. But the overall initiative did not go away. And I think the same for ESG, because I think some companies never even took it on in that way. They call it something else. But I would say, especially in my space, in the utilities space, like they've all got their net zero or carbon neutral, their 100% clean goals. some of them mean more than others. But
You know, we talked about this briefly with the interconnection queue, but what do you think are the challenges that we're going to face with the energy transition from a policy side, as well as just generally that the industry is going to face, especially with more renewables online, whether that's technology, storage, or just general policy stuff as well?
so what I get really concerned about is between 2028 and 2030. And what I get really concerned about is that we're going to have some kind of a summer event where everybody's going to have their air conditioners on. It's going to be really hot. Our coal plants will be gone. Our nuclear will run, but we won't have that much gas, and the wind won't be blowing. And then we'll have some blackouts. And then all these people will freak out and say, well, it's because we retired the coal plants. It's not, and because the wind didn't blow. And then we'll back off of our policy goals. That's what I get really concerned about. Like, I don't want to see CJ go away or get weakened. Like, we only want to be moving it forward. It might mean that we have to go a little more slowly in the short term. So I get really concerned about that. I do think that there are other policy areas, like, for instance, FERC recently has been looking at requiring NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Council. There's a lot of acronyms, and they're like looking at the reliability of the North American grid, right? And so they're looking at having NERC look at requirements for inverters, for distributed resources, and having basic requirements for having smart inverters. And the reason you do that is because you can get a lot of solar on the grid, and that would be really great from an energy perspective. But if it can actually be responsive to the grid and ramp up and down and back off and follow frequency, and then it's much more valuable to the grid. So if you can have basic minimum standards like that, then, and that matters at the state level too. We have our own interconnection proceedings for distributed energy. So that matters at the state level also. And so that's the kind of technological deployment and its interaction with policy that I think will be really important. And it's really wonky. So
How important do you think storage is in that picture?
Oh, incredibly. Yeah, the Illinois Power Agency is currently doing a report. I think it'll come out in March on how much storage we're going to need. But Sandia National Labs just did one with the Illinois Commerce Commission. So Zone 4 in MISO is the Ameren region downstate. And if we retire all the coal in the Ameren region and all the gas by 2045, how much storage will we need? It's a lot of storage. And that report kind of shows, under different assumptions, how much we're going to need. And right now it's not deployable in the way we need it to be. And the markets don't know how to deal with it. So, yeah.
One follow-up, this one. So in the near term, you feel like in order to avoid the scenario you described with us,
Storage.
Storage is one thing, but also do you think we still need some peaker plants around and not phase out gas as quickly as we are doing right now?
Those are two separate questions. I think not phasing it out might make sense. I don't know that California is talking about having and I think New Jersey was talking about this before too, having a climate reserve. That's what they were calling it. Having a group of peaker plants around that were never on, but that you could turn on when you needed them. There's a guy from NRDC, Tom Ratigliano, who always says that the road to 100 goes through 90. So if we can get to 90%, that's still really good. And so I think that's kind of where my head's at right now, because I don't think we have an answer for the last 10. Yeah, I agree. That's why I gave Tom credit. I couldn't. So, yeah. I think there were other, yeah. Okay.
I just want to ask you a bit about how do you convince states whose economies largely depend on fossil fuels to transition? So for example, in West Virginia, they largely depend on coal or say natural gas in North Dakota. How do you convince them to transition?
Well, so currently that's not quite my job, but in the past that was my job. And currently I do have to get them on board with stuff that we want to do, because a lot of my work now, we work in these OPSI, I mentioned, the organization PJM states. There's an organization of MISO states, and all of us come together, and those include North Dakota, it includes Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky. The transition is happening whether or not these states want it. Like they can subsidize coal like they do in Ohio and West Virginia. They can throw a lot of fits about gas, but we saw last December that we almost had rolling blackouts in PJM because 30% of the gas didn't show up when it was called on. And it was because their wellheads were frozen over, because they hadn't bought the gas, because they hadn't actually winterized their plants, like all these reasons. 92% of the failures last December were from gas plants. And so there's a lot of conversation happening in industry right now over whether they can really make the reliability claims that they make. So that's definitely a concern in any state that relies on any one resource right now is kind of in trouble. I will say that right now that the thing that moves the needle is very much on cost. So costs, because the transition is coming, whether they like it or not, costs, and because electrification is coming, whether they like it or not, costs are only going to go up because we have to build the transmission to sustain the system, because we have to build the generation and the capacity and the transmission to support things like data centers, like electric vehicles, like Bitcoin mining. And all of that means cost for the entire system. And so what has worked with West Virginia and Kentucky and North Dakota and Ohio is the cost argument. That if we do this holistically, if we accommodate Illinois policy while making sure Ohio is not paying for it, that we can come up with solutions that save everybody money. Like we might still pay more because we've got the policy, but it could save everybody money. So, yeah. Yeah.
Well, and so kind of piggybacking off of that and something you said earlier, you mentioned that the markets don't really know how to deal with a lot of these changes.
Yeah.
How much of your policy works with kind of that cost-benefit analysis and ensuring that the markets and incentives work the way you need them to?
So that's like my job.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I'll loop it into this career conversation, and that like I started this job not really knowing that much about MISO and PJM. I had done some work with the cities on like explaining why demand response opt-outs are important, and why they should care about various issues at these RTO levels, but I hadn't really engaged. I kind of knew what FERC was. I knew it was like quasi-judicial. But yeah, on the policy side of things, I've lost it. Remind me what your actual question was.
So how your policy works with cost-benefit?
Yes, cost-benefit. Yes. And that is my job. Yes. That's how I started this. So I got into this work because I wanted to work in energy policy, and I knew that there was this opening at the ICC, but I didn't really know what it was. And so much of it has been, oh, we want to do this thing as the state, but the markets don't actually want us to do this thing. And so let's like convince them that they have to let us do this thing. And sometimes we have the law on our side. The Public Utilities Act requires or lands their jurisdiction over the generation side of things with the states. States have jurisdiction over resource adequacy and planning. Illinois is in kind of a weird position because in 1997, we became a retail competition state. So we don't regulate generation for the most part, but we do regulate the system still. So, so we still have a seat at all these tables, and the markets they're set up to add lumpy amounts of generation. This is where the queue problem comes in, right? You get like a few power plants in the queue at a time. Now you've got like all these little solar farms and everything. And so a lot of what we have to do is sit on hours and hours of conference calls and listen to the issues being debated among industry insiders and try to figure out, okay, where's the argument for why they need to make a change that accommodates what states want to do. And that's where these regional bodies are really important, OPSI and OMS, because we bring all the states together, and where we can, will come with the voice of all the states. And FERC is really responsive to that right now, especially because 2 of the FERC commissioners come from the states. But the markets are not, they're set up for big baseload generation. They're set up operationally to handle big baseload generation. Like, let's call the natural gas plants on the phone and say, we're going to need you in 15 minutes. Like, that is actually what they have to do now. And so there are all these ways in which they are just not set up for the world that we're building here in Illinois. And so a lot of it is engaging through those stakeholder processes, providing comment, protesting and commenting at FERC as the Illinois Commerce Commission, negotiating with our other states to try to get state positions put together to then write letters to the PJM board and have, because the board has filing rights and can change the mind of the staff at PJM. So that's a lot of what we do. And it does require a lot of that market interaction and market reform. Yeah. And some of it is us responding to the markets too. So if they put in a rule, we might have to change things. But yeah. But just because
do you have business cards by any chance?
I did not bring them, but I'm happy if you want to share my information. That's totally fine. It's all in my signature. But you haven't asked me yet.
Yes. I wanted to revisit your career trajectory.
Yeah.
Like, what made you, and how did you make the transition between like advocacy and government? And what are the big differences? Anything you dislike about this choice?
No, I love what I'm doing now. I think it's a really good fit for my personality. But advocacy, there's a lot more room. There's a lot more, like, it's a lot freer and things move quickly. And you can be really ambitious with like goal setting and negotiation. The government side of things moves a lot slower. It just by its nature, because there's a lot of process involved, but you get to really tangibly see the impact of the policy advocacy. So it's like a whole trail, right? So there was stuff that I was working on as an advocate that I'm now seeing kind of trickle down into the implementation space, and that's pretty exciting. You have to learn about things like procurement processes. You have to learn about, you have to call the minutes twice. You have to get things on the calendar 2 weeks in advance because of the sunshine laws. No 2 commissioners can be in the room. No 3 commissioners can be in the room at the same time without public notice of that meeting. Make sure there aren't 3 of those commissioners on a phone call even, because, so you have to, like, there are all these rules, but it's pretty amazing to like tangibly see the impact. So, yep. So does that help? Yeah. The advocacy space is full. I will say both spaces have been full of really amazing, like passionate, involved people. And that's been really fortunate. Like I have a lot of friends who complain about their jobs and I don't have to do that. So,
Thank you so much.
yeah.